"He's flying, Dad. He's really flying." The whispered words from 8-year-old Marcus Chen were the first he had spoken in 6 months, since the accident that had stolen his ability to walk. Billionaire Alexander Chen felt his heart stop as he watched his paralyzed son lean forward in his wheelchair, mesmerized by a teenage boy in torn jeans who was dancing impossible stories of hope in the sterile hospital corridor. The doctors had said Marcus would never walk again, never speak again, never be the same again. But this mysterious dancer, this miracle worker with duct-taped shoes, was awakening something in his son that all the money in the world couldn't buy. The autumn rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the children's hospital as billionaire tech mogul Alexander Chen pushed his son's wheelchair down the sterile corridor. 8-year-old Marcus Chen sat motionless, his once bright eyes now vacant, staring at nothing as they had for the past 6 months since the accident that had stolen not just his ability to walk, but seemingly his will to live. The doctors had said the spinal injury was complete, that Marcus would never walk again. But it was the silence that truly broke Alexander's heart. His son hadn't spoken a single word since that terrible night. They were heading to another physical therapy session that Marcus would endure with the same lifeless compliance he showed everything else, when the sound stopped Alexander in his tracks. Music was drifting from the pediatric ward's common room, but not the usual gentle melodies meant to soothe sick children. This was something alive, electric, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to make the very walls vibrate with energy. Alexander wheeled Marcus toward the sound, and what he saw through the doorway made him freeze in disbelief. A boy, no more than 16, was dancing in the center of the room with a grace and power that defied every law of physics Alexander thought he understood. The teenager's clothes were worn and patched, his sneakers held together with duct tape, but when he moved, he transformed the sterile hospital space into something magical. Children in wheelchairs, kids with 4 poles, young patients who hadn't smiled in weeks were all gathered around him, their faces lit with wonder as he spun and leaped and told stories with his body that words could never capture. But it was Marcus's reaction that sent shockwaves through Alexander's chest. For the first time in 6 months, his son was leaning forward in his wheelchair, his eyes tracking every movement, his mouth slightly open in amazement. The boy was dancing a story about a young warrior who had lost his legs in battle but discovered he could fly. And as he soared through the air in impossible defiance of gravity, Marcus whispered something so quietly that Alexander almost missed it. "He's flying, Dad. He's really flying." The words hit Alexander like lightning, the first his son had spoken since the accident, and as tears blurred his vision, he watched this mysterious dancer, this miracle worker in torn jeans, give his son something that all the money in the world hadn't been able to buy: hope. If you believe in the power of unexpected miracles and the magic that happens when broken hearts find healing in the most unlikely places, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances, and subscribe to Acts of Depth for more stories that remind us that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come wrapped in the most ordinary packages. The dancer's name was Jamie Rodriguez, and his story unfolded like a map of resilience drawn in struggle and determination. Alexander learned this 3 days later when he returned to the hospital, not for Marcus's appointment, but to find the boy who had awakened something in his son that the best doctors in the country couldn't touch. He discovered Jamie in the hospital's volunteer coordinator office, filling out paperwork with hands that bore the calluses of someone who worked construction sites after school to help his single mother pay rent on their 1-bedroom apartment in East Oakland. Jamie had started coming to the children's hospital 6 months ago, not because of any formal program or community service requirement, but because his younger sister Sophia had spent 3 weeks there battling pneumonia. During those long, frightening nights when his mother worked double shifts as a hotel housekeeper and couldn't be there, Jamie had entertained Sophia and the other children with the only gift he possessed: his ability to move in ways that made people forget their pain, if only for a few precious moments. "I learned to dance on the streets," Jamie told Alexander with a quiet dignity that belied his 16 years. "When you don't have money for entertainment, you make your own. When you don't have space to be loud, you learn to speak with your body. When you see kids hurting and you can't afford to buy them toys or games, you give them the only thing you have, yourself." Alexander watched through the observation window as Jamie worked with Marcus during what had become their daily sessions. The boy had an intuitive understanding of how to reach children that no medical textbook could teach. He would start slowly, telling stories through movement, creating characters that faced impossible odds and found ways to overcome them. Marcus, who had refused to participate in traditional physical therapy, began attempting small movements, trying to mirror Jamie's gestures from his wheelchair. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Marcus started speaking more, asking questions about the stories Jamie told through dance, requesting specific characters and adventures. His appetite returned, and with it, a spark of curiosity about the world that had been extinguished since the accident. Alexander found himself arriving early to watch these sessions, marveling at how this teenager with nothing had succeeded where teams of expensive specialists had failed. But it was during their 4th week together that Alexander witnessed something that would change the trajectory of all their lives. Jamie was telling the story of a young prince who had to learn to rule his kingdom from a throne he couldn't leave, demonstrating how true power came not from physical strength, but from the ability to inspire others. As he danced, Marcus began moving his arms in rhythm, and for one impossible moment, Alexander could have sworn he saw his son's legs twitch in response to the music. Dr. Sarah Martinez, Marcus's neurologist, was skeptical when Alexander described what he'd seen. "Mr. Chun, I understand your hope, but Marcus's injury was complete. The spinal cord was severed. What you're seeing might be involuntary muscle spasms, but they don't indicate any restoration of function." Yet Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was happening in that hospital room, something that transcended medical understanding. Jamie wasn't just entertaining his son. He was reaching into places that science couldn't touch, awakening possibilities that existed beyond the realm of X-rays and MRI scans. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Alexander arrived to find Marcus attempting to stand from his wheelchair, his small hands gripping the armrests as he tried to lift himself up. Jamie was beside him, not physically supporting him but dancing a story of encouragement, his movements flowing like water around Marcus's determined efforts. "I want to try, Dad," Marcus said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. Jamie says the warrior in the story had to believe he could fly before his wings would work. "I want to believe I can stand." As Alexander watched his son strain against the limitations that had defined his world for 6 months, he realized that Jamie Rodriguez had given them something more valuable than any medical breakthrough. He had given them the courage to hope again, and in that hope, Alexander began to see possibilities that would challenge everything he thought he knew about healing, about miracles, and about the power of one person's gift to transform the lives of everyone around them. The memory that changed everything came flooding back to Alexander on a rain-soaked Thursday evening as he sat in his Palo Alto mansion, watching Marcus practice the arm movements Jamie had taught him. It was the sight of his son's determined concentration that triggered the recollection, a moment from Alexander's own childhood that he had buried beneath decades of corporate success and calculated decisions. He was 8 years old again, lying in a hospital bed in Taiwan after a car accident that had left him with 2 broken legs and a shattered pelvis. His parents, poor factory workers who spoke no English, could only visit on weekends, leaving young Alexander alone with his fear and pain for days at a time. The American doctors spoke in medical terms he couldn't understand, and the other children in the ward were too sick to play. He had felt invisible, forgotten, convinced that he would never walk normally again. Then came David, a teenage volunteer who spoke broken Mandarin and danced like he was made of liquid light. David would visit Alexander every day after school, telling stories through movement about brave children who overcame impossible obstacles. He taught Alexander that healing wasn't just about bones and muscles. It was about believing in your own strength, about finding joy even in the darkest moments. David had been poor too, Alexander remembered now, wearing the same clothes day after day, but he had possessed something that money couldn't buy, the ability to see potential where others saw only limitation. The parallel was so striking it took Alexander's breath away. Jamie Rodriguez was David, 30 years later, giving to Marcus what David had given to him. But there was something else, something that made Alexander's hands tremble as he reached for his phone to call his private investigator. David's last name had been Rodriguez. David Rodriguez, who had disappeared from Alexander's life when his family moved away. leaving behind only the memory of a boy who had taught him that miracles came disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The investigation took 3 days, and when the results came back, Alexander stared at the documents with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. Jamie Rodriguez was David's son. David, who had died 5 years ago in a construction accident, leaving behind a wife and 2 children with nothing but medical bills and the memory of a man who had spent his life bringing joy to others. Jamie had inherited more than his father's gift for movement. He had inherited his father's heart, his instinct for finding the broken and helping them heal. But the revelation that shook Alexander to his core came in the final paragraph of the investigator's report. David Rodriguez had kept a journal throughout his life, documenting the children he had worked with, the small victories and breakthrough moments that had made his volunteer work meaningful. In that journal, found among his possessions after his death, was an entry dated 30 years ago about a young Taiwanese boy named Alexander Chun, who had learned to walk again not because of medical intervention, but because he had learned to believe in himself. Today Alexander took his first steps since the accident. David had written. He doesn't know it yet, but he's going to do something important with his life. I can see it in his eyes, the same determination that will carry him through whatever challenges await him. I hope someday he remembers that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about discovering what was always whole inside us. Alexander closed the file and looked across the room at Marcus, who was attempting to shift his weight in his wheelchair while following one of Jamie's movement exercises. The circle was completing itself in ways that defied explanation, and Alexander realized that his wealth, his success, his entire empire had been built on the foundation of hope that a poor teenager named David Rodriguez had given him 3 decades ago. The next morning, Alexander made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. He called his lawyers and instructed them to draft documents that would change not just Jamie's life, but the lives of countless children who needed what Jamie could give them. But first, he had to tell Jamie the truth about who his father had been, and how a dance performed in a hospital room 30 years ago had set in motion events that would now come full circle in ways that neither of them could have imagined. The meeting Alexander had arranged took place in the hospital's family conference room, but what should have been a moment of revelation and gratitude quickly transformed into something far more complex when Dr. Richard Blackwood, the hospital's chief administrator, arrived with an expression that could have frozen summer rain. Blackwood had built his career on maintaining the institution's reputation and controlling every variable that might threaten the carefully constructed image of medical excellence that attracted wealthy donors like Alexander Chun. "Mr. Chun," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I understand you've become quite attached to one of our volunteers, but I'm afraid there's been a serious breach of protocol that we need to address immediately." Alexander felt the temperature in the room drop as Blackwood placed a thick folder on the conference table. Jamie sat beside him, his usual confidence replaced by the wary tension of someone who had learned early in life that authority figures rarely brought good news to people like him. "Young Mr. Rodriguez has been conducting unauthorized therapeutic activities with patients," Blackwood continued, opening the folder to reveal photographs taken through the observation windows, images of Jamie dancing with Marcus, of other children attempting to move in response to his stories, of moments that Alexander had witnessed as miraculous being presented as evidence of wrongdoing. "Furthermore," Blackwood said, his tone growing colder, "we've discovered that Mr. Rodriguez has been misrepresenting his qualifications. He has no formal training in physical therapy, no certification in child psychology, no credentials whatsoever that would authorize him to work with vulnerable patients. What he's been doing could be considered practicing medicine without a license." Jamie's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "I never claimed to be a doctor or a therapist. I'm just a volunteer who dances with kids to help them feel better. There's nothing illegal about that, isn't there?" Blackwood replied with a smile that held no warmth. "When your unauthorized activities result in a patient attempting dangerous movements that could exacerbate their injuries, when you give false hope to families dealing with permanent disabilities, when you undermine the professional medical advice that patients and their families depend on." Alexander watched the exchange with growing anger, recognizing the familiar pattern of institutional power being used to crush individual initiative. He had seen it countless times in the corporate world, bureaucrats who protected their territory by destroying anything they couldn't control, regardless of the value it might provide. Dr. Blackwood, Alexander said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built a tech empire. My son has shown more improvement in the past month than he has in the previous 6 months of traditional therapy. If Jamie's methods are producing results, Blackwood interrupted, his professional mask slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. Mr. Chen, I understand that grief and desperation can cloud judgment, but we cannot allow unqualified individuals to give false hope to families dealing with permanent disabilities. Your son's condition is irreversible, and encouraging him to believe otherwise is not just medically irresponsible. It's cruel. The words hung in the air like poison, and Alexander saw Jamie flinch as if he'd been physically struck. This was about more than hospital protocols or medical credentials. This was about a system that couldn't tolerate the possibility that healing might come from sources it couldn't quantify, control, or profit from. Moreover, Blackwood continued, clearly enjoying his position of power, we've received complaints from other families about the disruption Mr. Rodriguez's activities have caused. Some parents feel that his performances are inappropriate for a medical setting, that they trivialize the serious nature of their children's conditions. Alexander felt something cold and hard settle in his chest as he realized what was really happening. Blackwood wasn't protecting patients. He was protecting a system that had failed his son, a system that measured success only in terms that could be documented and billed. Jamie represented something that threatened that system. The possibility that healing could come from compassion rather than technology, from hope rather than resignation. Dr. Blackwood, Alexander said, his voice taking on the edge that had made corporate competitors think twice about challenging him. Are you telling me that you're going to ban a volunteer who has brought joy and hope to sick children because he doesn't have the right pieces of paper? I'm telling you, Blackwood replied, his own voice hardening, that this hospital has protocols and standards that exist to protect our patients and our reputation. Mr. Rodriguez's volunteer privileges are hereby revoked, effective immediately. Security will escort him from the premises, and he is not to return. As if summoned by his words, 2 security guards appeared in the doorway, their presence transforming the conference room into something that felt more like an interrogation chamber than a place of healing. Jamie stood slowly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation being heaped upon him, and Alexander realized that he was witnessing more than just bureaucratic overreach. He was watching the same system that had nearly broken his own spirit 30 years ago preparing to destroy the son of the man who had saved him, and this time Alexander Chun had the power to fight back. Continue? The confrontation that followed would be remembered in the hospital's history as the day a billionaire's quiet fury reshaped an entire institution. Alexander Chun rose from his chair with the controlled precision of someone who had spent decades turning obstacles into opportunities. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of resources that could build hospitals or tear them down. Dr. Blackwood, Alexander said, his tone deceptively calm. Before your security escorts anyone anywhere, I think you should know that I've been considering a substantial donation to this hospital. $50 million, to be exact, for a new pediatric wing that would serve children from underserved communities. Blackwood's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his professional armor as he processed the implications of what Alexander was saying. $50 million was more than the hospital's annual budget for capital improvements, the kind of donation that could transform the institution's capabilities and secure Blackwood's legacy as an administrator. However, Alexander continued, his voice growing harder, I've just realized that this institution doesn't share my values regarding what truly heals children, so instead, I'll be founding the Rodriguez Center for Pediatric Innovation, named after David Rodriguez, a man who understood that healing comes from more than just medical procedures. Jamie looked up sharply at the mention of his father's name, confusion and hope warring in his expression. Alexander had planned to reveal the connection between their families privately, but Blackwood's cruelty had changed everything. Some truths were too important to whisper in shadows. Jamie, Alexander said, turning to face the young man who had given his son back his voice. Your father saved my life 30 years ago, not with medicine or surgery, but with the same gift you've inherited. He taught me to believe in myself when I was lying in a hospital bed, convinced I would never walk again. Everything I've accomplished since then, my company, my success, my ability to provide for my family, it all started with the hope your father gave me. The revelation rippled through the room like electricity. Jamie's eyes widened as he processed what Alexander was telling him, while Blackwood's face cycled through expressions of disbelief, calculation, and growing alarm as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. The Rodriguez Center, Alexander continued, his voice gaining momentum as the vision crystallized in his mind, will be a place where children like Marcus can receive both traditional medical care and the kind of healing that comes from art, movement, and the belief that miracles are possible. Jamie will be our director of therapeutic arts, and will train others to carry on the work that his father began. But it was what happened next that transformed the moment from corporate maneuvering into something transcendent. Marcus, who had been sitting quietly in his wheelchair throughout the confrontation, suddenly gripped the armrests and began to push himself upward. His legs, which doctors had declared permanently paralyzed, trembled with effort as he fought to stand. "Jamie," Marcus said, his voice clear and strong, "show them the flying story. Show them how the warrior learned to soar." Jamie looked at Alexander, who nodded through tears he didn't try to hide, then began to move. But this wasn't the gentle, therapeutic dancing he had done in the hospital rooms. This was something primal and powerful, a celebration of the human spirit's refusal to accept limitations. As Jamie leaped and spun, telling the story of a warrior who discovered that true flight came not from wings, but from the courage to believe in the impossible, Marcus continued his struggle to stand. And then, in a moment that would be seared into the memory of everyone present, Marcus Chun rose from his wheelchair. His legs shook with the effort, his small body trembled with the strain, but he stood, not because medical science said he could, but because a young dancer had taught him that some truths transcended what doctors could measure. Dr. Blackwood stared in stunned silence as Marcus took one tentative step, then another, his movement awkward but undeniably real. The security guards lowered their hands, their mission forgotten in the face of something that challenged everything they thought they understood about what was possible. "This is impossible," Blackwood whispered, his professional certainty crumbling as he watched a child with a complete spinal injury defy every medical prediction. "No," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion as he watched his son take his first steps in 6 months. "This is what happens when we stop limiting ourselves to what we think we know and start believing in what we can't yet explain." 6 months later, the Rodriguez Center for Pediatric Innovation opened its doors in a gleaming facility that combined state-of-the-art medical equipment with dance studios, art therapy rooms, and spaces designed for the kind of healing that couldn't be prescribed or measured. Jamie Rodriguez, now 18 and enrolled in a special program that would earn him credentials in both dance therapy and child psychology, worked alongside doctors and nurses who had learned to see their young patients not as collections of symptoms but as whole human beings capable of extraordinary resilience. Marcus Chun walked into the center's opening ceremony on his own 2 legs, his recovery documented in medical journals as a case study in the power of hope and determination to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But for those who had witnessed his journey, the real miracle wasn't medical. It was the reminder that healing often comes from the most unexpected sources, wrapped in the most ordinary packages. Dr. Blackwood had quietly resigned, replaced by an administrator who understood that true medical excellence meant embracing every tool that could help children heal, whether it came from a laboratory or from the heart of a young man who had learned to dance on the streets and discovered that movement could be medicine. As Alexander watched Jamie work with a new group of children, teaching them that their limitations were not their definitions, he thought about the circle that had completed itself across 3 decades. David Rodriguez had given hope to a broken child, who grew up to become a man with the power to ensure that his son's gift would reach countless others. It was a legacy built not on wealth or status, but on the simple truth that sometimes the most profound healing comes from one person's willingness to share their light with others who have forgotten how to shine. The dance continued, as it always had, as it always would. A celebration of the human spirit's refusal to accept that broken meant beyond repair, that different meant less than, that hope was a luxury rather than a necessity. And in that dance, children learned to fly not because they grew wings, but because someone believed they could soar. If this story has reminded you that miracles often come disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, share it with someone who needs to believe in the power of hope to transform the impossible into the inevitable. Subscribe to Acts of Depth for more stories that celebrate the courage to see potential where others see only limitation. Because sometimes the most important healing happens not in operating rooms but in the spaces where broken hearts learn to beat with hope again.